Nia's eyes fluttered open, her head pounding as she tried to make sense of her surroundings. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and something faintly rotten, a musty decay that clung to every breath she took. A dim glow from a single flickering candle cast elongated shadows across the walls, warping the shapes of the furniture into twisted, unfamiliar figures. Her heart pounded in her chest as she pushed herself up, the rough fabric of the couch beneath her scratching at her skin. She didn't recognize this place. The walls were adorned with faded wallpaper, peeling at the edges as if time itself had begun to consume them. A heavy silence filled the space, so complete it pressed down on her like an unseen force. She swallowed hard, trying to grasp onto a memory, any memory, that could explain how she had ended up here. Nothing came. Her mind was a blank slate, save for the lingering sensation of fear curling in the pit of her stomach. She stood up cautiously, her bare feet pressing into the cold wooden floor. A sudden creak echoed through the room, and she spun around, but there was nothing, only shadows. Her first instinct was to find a way out. She moved to the nearest door and grasped the handle, twisting it desperately. Locked. She tried another. Locked. The windows were no different. Boards nailed tightly over the glass, sealing her inside as if the house itself refused to let her leave. A shiver ran down her spine. There was something unnatural about the way the air sat still, the way the darkness pooled in the corners of the room like it was alive. She called out, her voice breaking the silence, but the sound was swallowed almost instantly, fading into nothingness. Panic began to claw at her chest. She wasn't just alone. She was trapped. And somewhere, in the unseen depths of the house, something was watching. A faint whisper slithered through the silence, barely audible yet unmistakable. Nia froze, her breath catching in her throat. She wasn't alone. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for the source, but there was nothing. Just the oppressive stillness of the house. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from the hallway beyond the closed door. Her pulse hammered as she pressed her back against the wall, willing herself to disappear into the shadows. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, then stopped just outside the door. She held her breath. The doorknob rattled. Nia's heart nearly stopped. She clenched her fists, ready to run, but the door didn't open. Instead, a long, drawn-out creak echoed through the hallway, like another door swinging open. Then, silence. Forcing herself to move, she tiptoed toward the door and pressed her ear against it. Nothing. Swallowing hard, she slowly twisted the handle, expecting resistance, but to her surprise, it turned easily. The hallway stretched before her, bathed in dim candlelight from old sconces lining the walls. She took cautious steps forward, her breath shallow. The wooden floor groaned beneath her weight. A shadow flickered across the end of the hall, disappearing into an open doorway. She stopped abruptly, her blood running cold. "Hello?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. No answer. The air felt heavier here, thick, with something unseen. She passed a small wooden table where she had placed an old candle earlier, but now it was gone. Her stomach twisted. She turned quickly, scanning the hallway. There, on another table, in a completely different room, was the same candle, its wick smouldering as if just blown out. A lump formed in her throat. This wasn't possible. She knew exactly where she had placed it. She stumbled backward, her shoulder hitting something. Turning sharply, she found herself facing a large, dust-covered mirror. The glass was so grimy that she could barely make out her reflection, but as she wiped at the surface with trembling fingers, she saw movement in the reflection. Something, or someone, stood behind her. She spun around, her heart slamming against her ribs. The hallway was empty. Her breaths came in short gasps. Her skin prickled as a realization took hold. This wasn't just a house. It was something else, something watching, something playing with her, and she had no way out. A cold shiver crawled up Nia's spine as a deep, raspy voice slithered through the walls. It was neither near nor far, but everywhere at once. You can never leave. Her body stiffened. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating, as if the house itself had spoken. Her pulse thundered in her ears. The shadows in the hallway seemed to stretch and shift, forming shapes that were almost human, but not quite. Then, at the far end of the corridor, a figure emerged. A man. He was draped in dark, tattered robes that barely swayed as he moved, as if gravity itself held no power over him. His face was obscured by a deep hood, but Nia could feel his gaze piercing through her. Cold, unfeeling, possessive. She wanted to run, but her legs refused to obey. "You belong to the house now," the voice whispered again, but this time it came from the figure. Nia gasped, stumbling backward, her hand brushing against the wall for support. Her breath came in short, panicked bursts. Memories surfaced in fragments, of a dream, or maybe a nightmare, a vague figure, a man in dark robes, a whisper in her ear. Had she been lured here? Her throat tightened. This couldn't be real. She forced herself to speak. "Who are you?" Silence. The figure took a step forward. The candlelight flickered violently, casting wild shadows across the walls. Nia's heart pounded. The house felt alive, its very air charged with something unnatural. The figure raised a hand, fingers long and claw-like, pointing straight at her. "Leave?" A low chuckle, dry as brittle bones. "There is no leaving." And then, in a blink, he was gone. The hallway stretched before her, empty once more. The oppressive silence returned, but now it was worse, because she knew. She was not alone, and something wanted her to stay. Forever. The wooden floor groaned beneath Nia's hesitant steps as she pushed open the heavy door. A gust of stale air greeted her, thick with dust and something else, something ancient. She had stumbled into what looked like a study. Bookshelves lined the walls, their wooden frames warped with age. Papers were scattered across the floor, yellowed with time, as if someone had left in a hurry. A large wooden desk sat at the center, covered in ink-stained pages, melted candle wax, and a single, worn, leather-bound diary. But it wasn't the books or the papers that made her breath hitch. It was the walls. Every inch of them was covered in writing. Some were scratched into the wood, others scrawled hastily in ink or something darker. Strange symbols she didn't recognize twisted and curled into ominous patterns. But the words, those she understood, and they made her blood run cold. "Don't trust the house. He sees everything. The door is a lie." Nia's fingers trembled as she reached out to trace one of the messages. The ink had long dried, but the desperation in the handwriting was unmistakable. Who had written these? Her gaze swept across the room, landing on the desk. The diary. She hesitated before picking it up, the leather cool against her fingertips. The pages were brittle, filled with hurried scribbles in a faded hand. As she flipped through, the words unraveled a terrible truth. This was someone else's story. A woman, trapped, over a century ago. The entries were fragmented, speaking of a shadowed figure who whispered in the dark, of doors that led nowhere, of time itself twisting and looping. And then, her fingers froze. There, among the scrawled warnings and desperate pleas, was her own name. "Nia, you were here before." Her stomach lurched. That wasn't possible. She had never been in this house before. Had she? Her heart pounded as she flipped to the last written page. The ink was fresher, the strokes uneven, as if written in a hurry. "There is a way out." Her breath caught. Below the words was a symbol, a small, crude drawing of a key. And underneath, in almost unreadable script, a final warning. "But the price is too great." Nia's grip tightened around the diary. A way out. But at what cost? The house groaned, a slow, deep creak that echoed through the study. Something had changed. Something knew what she had just read. And it was watching. Nia's hands trembled as she flipped through the crumbling pages of an old newspaper, its edges yellowed with age. The headline sent a chill through her bones. Nobleman's estate under investigation. Dozens vanished without a trace. Her eyes darted across the article. The words blurred together in the dim candlelight, but the story was clear enough. This house, the one she was trapped in, had once belonged to a reclusive nobleman named Lord Mavuso. Whispers of black magic surrounded his name. Townsfolk claimed he dabbled in dark arts, his estate a place of unholy rituals. Many who entered never came back. The authorities had searched the property multiple times, but no bodies were ever found. No proof, just vanished lives. A fresh wave of dread rolled over her. Swallowing hard, she moved to another stack of documents on the desk. Some were letters, others old journal entries. One described a deal, a bargain made with an unknown entity. The nobleman had sought immortality, and in return, the house itself had become something unnatural, a living prison. The walls do not forget. The house does not forgive. The debt must always be paid. Nia felt a tightness in her chest. She reached for another paper, but her fingers stopped just short of an ornate frame leaning against the bookshelf. Dust coated its surface, but something about it pulled at her. Slowly she wiped it clean, and nearly screamed. It was a painting of her. Same dark curls, same deep brown eyes filled with fear. But the date at the bottom was from 120 years ago. Her breath caught in her throat. No, this wasn't possible. She stumbled back, her mind racing. Had she been here before? Had she? The air grew thick. A low hum reverberated through the walls, a pulse that wasn't there a moment ago. The realization struck like lightning. She wasn't just trapped. She had always been meant to be here. Nia refused to accept this nightmare as her reality. Her heart pounded as she sprinted to the nearest window, slamming her fists against the cold glass. It didn't even rattle. She grabbed a heavy chair and swung it with all her strength. The impact sent a violent shudder through her arms, but the window remained unbroken. Outside, the view unsettled her. It wasn't the world she remembered. Instead of streets, houses, or even a sky, there was only an endless abyss. A swirling, shifting void of shadows. A world that shouldn't exist. No, she whispered, stepping back, shaking her head. This isn't real. Her mind raced. A door. There has to be a door. She turned and ran down the hall, checking every knob. Locked, locked, locked. Then, her fingers wrapped around an ornate brass key resting on a nearby table. Hope surged through her as she shoved it into the nearest lock. The key turned with a soft click, and she pushed the door open. But instead of leading outside, she was back in the same hallway. Nia gasped, spinning around. The table where she'd found the key was still there. The same flickering candle, the same dusty books. She had gone nowhere. A tremor ran through her hands. She tried another door, and another. Each one led her right back to where she started. Desperation clawed at her chest. She rushed into a room lined with mirrors, hoping to see something, a reflection of the real world, an opening, an answer. But as she stared, the mirror didn't show her reflection at all. Instead, it displayed someone else. A woman, dressed in clothes centuries old, her eyes hollow and pleading. Nia stepped closer. The woman in the mirror did not. Then, in one horrifying motion, the woman reached out. Cracks splintered across the glass. Dark liquid oozed from the fractures, dripping onto the floor like ink. Nia stumbled backward, her breath caught in her throat. The walls groaned, shifting around her like a living thing. The hallway stretched, warped, swallowed doors that were once there. The more she fought, the more the house closed in on her. She wasn't escaping. She was sinking deeper. Nia's breath came in sharp gasps as she pressed her back against the cold wall, heart pounding in her chest. The house was shifting again, swallowing doors, twisting hallways, warping reality itself. She clenched her fists, fighting the terror that threatened to consume her. Then she heard it. A whisper, soft, fragile, yet unmistakably calling her name. Nia. She froze. The voice came from beneath the floor, seeping through the cracks in the wooden panels. She hesitated, glancing down. A small rug near the end of the hallway was slightly askew, revealing something beneath it. She hurried forward, yanking it away to find a rusted iron ring embedded in the floor. A trapdoor. With a deep breath, she pulled it open, the old wood groaning in protest. A rush of stale, icy air swept over her. Below, a set of crumbling stone steps disappeared into darkness. Nia, come quickly. The voice was weak, but urgent. She swallowed hard. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, but she had no other choice. Gripping the edge of the hatch, she lowered herself into the depths. The air grew heavier as she descended, her steps careful on the uneven ground. At the bottom, flickering candlelight illuminated a small, damp room lined with shelves filled with dusty jars and brittle paper. In the far corner, a figure sat hunched over, a frail, skeletal woman wrapped in tattered fabric. Her silver hair hung in tangled strands around her sunken face, her eyes hollow yet sharp. You're real, Nia breathed, stepping closer. The woman lifted her head slowly. Real enough, but not for much longer. Nia swallowed. Who are you? A prisoner, like you. The woman's voice was raspy, as if she hadn't spoken in years. I have been here, longer than I can remember. Nia knelt beside her. How do we escape? The woman chuckled, though there was no humor in it. The house feeds on your fear, child. The more you run, the more it tightens its grip. Nia's stomach twisted. So what do I do? The woman's gaze darkened. You must face the truth. What truth? She reached out, her frail fingers curling around Nia's wrist with surprising strength. The master of this house. He is not human. He chose you for a reason. Nia's pulse raced. What do you mean? Why me? The woman shuddered, her voice barely a whisper now. You must find the heart of the house. The heart. The woman's fingers loosened, her breath rattling. Before he finds you first. Then, before Nia could ask anything more, the candles flickered violently. A deep, guttural growl rumbled through the walls. He knew she was here, and he was coming. The air in the hidden passage was thick, heavy with an almost tangible presence. Nia moved cautiously, her fingers trailing along the damp stone walls. The whispers had led her here, to a place buried deep within the house's core. Then she saw it. A door unlike any other she had encountered. It was ancient, its surface covered in pulsating, vein-like tendrils that twisted and writhed as if alive. At the center, an intricate symbol was carved, glowing faintly with an eerie red light. Her stomach twisted as she stepped closer. This was it, the heart of the house. With a deep breath, she pressed her hands against the door. The moment she made contact, a powerful tremor surged through the walls. The door groaned, and then, slowly, it swung open. What lay beyond made her blood run cold. In the center of the chamber, suspended in the air like a grotesque, beating entity, was a massive, fleshy heart. Thick, dark veins stretched out from it, weaving through the walls and ceiling like the roots of a monstrous tree. The entire room pulsed in rhythm with its slow, sickening thuds. Nia gagged, stepping back, but the door slammed shut behind her. She was trapped inside. The whispers grew louder, swirling around her, hissing fragmented words. Remember, see, the truth. The heart pulsed violently, and the shadows in the room shifted. Images flashed before her eyes, scenes she couldn't understand at first. A young girl crying in a dimly lit bedroom. A man standing over her, his face obscured. A fire consuming a home, screams echoing into the night. And then, Nia herself, a younger version of her, staring wide-eyed at something she couldn't quite grasp. A sharp pain stabbed through her skull. The truth was trying to surface. She clutched her head, gasping. The house wasn't just any cursed place. It was bound to the pain of those it had trapped. Their suffering fueled it. Their fears sustained it. And she had been here before. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. The fragmented memories, the whispers, they weren't just from strangers. They were hers. The secret no one knew wasn't just about the house. It was about her. A deep, guttural laugh echoed through the chamber as the shadows coiled together, forming a monstrous figure. The master of the house stood before Nia, his presence suffocating, his eyes two voids of endless darkness. "You return to me as you always do," the entity whispered, its voice slithering into her mind like poisoned silk. Nia staggered back. "No, this is my first time here." The entity tilted its head, amused. "Is it?" And then, like a dam breaking, memories surged into her. She had been here before, many times. Each attempt to escape had ended the same way. Failure. Each time she had fought, struggled, run. But the house had always claimed her in the end. Except now, she remembered something new. The truth. She was not just another victim. She was the first. It had been her grief, her rage, her suffering that had bound this house in darkness. She had been the catalyst, the one who had called this horror into existence long ago. "You are mine," the entity said, its long fingers stretching toward her. "Stay and rule beside me, or resist and perish once more." A choice. Nia's fingers clenched around the rusted dagger the old woman had given her. For centuries she had failed, but now she knew what she had to do. Summoning every ounce of courage, she turned and lunged toward the grotesque heart at the center of the chamber. The entity roared, shadows lashing out, trying to stop her. But this time, she was faster. With a cry, she drove the dagger deep into the pulsing mass. The house trembled. The walls cracked. A piercing wail filled the air. Nia twisted the blade, feeling the very fabric of the house unraveling around her. This was the end. Or so she hoped. The entire house trembled beneath Nia's feet, a deep guttural roar shaking the very foundation of the cursed structure. The dagger in her hands was slick with the thick black essence that had once pulsed through the grotesque beating heart at the core of the house. As she twisted the blade one final time, the heart gave a violent lurch, splitting open with a sickening squelch. A deafening scream erupted from the walls themselves, the sound of 1,000 tormented voices crying out in unison. The house was dying. The entity shrieked in fury, its form shifting wildly between shadow and solid mass, as if it were struggling to maintain its shape. "You fool!" it roared, its voice shaking the very air around her. "You think you can escape me? You think destroying this heart will free you?" Nia didn't wait to hear more. She turned and ran. The chamber was collapsing, the walls cracking apart as tendrils of darkness lashed out in desperation. The torches flickered wildly, their flames turning an eerie blue before vanishing into nothingness. The cursed energy that had held the house together for centuries was unraveling, piece by piece. She sprinted through the hallways, her heart pounding, her lungs burning. The house was no longer just shifting, it was disintegrating. Doors that had once been sealed shut now swung open violently, revealing twisted, nightmarish landscapes beyond them. Shadows clawed at her ankles, whispering, pleading, cursing her as she pushed forward. Then she heard them, the voices. All around her, ghostly figures emerged from the walls, their translucent forms flickering like candlelight. Men, women, and children. Souls that had been trapped for years, for decades, maybe even centuries. Their eyes were hollow, their faces twisted in sorrow and confusion. But as the house crumbled, something changed. One by one, the spirits began to lift. their forms glowing brighter. The curse was breaking. She saw the old woman from the cellar standing in the hallway, her frail hands reaching out toward the fading light. "You did it," the woman whispered, her voice no longer filled with despair. "You set us free." But there was no time to stop. The walls were folding in on themselves, the wooden beams groaning as if the house itself was wailing in agony. She kept running. The grand staircase loomed ahead, but it was no longer sturdy. It was crumbling, steps falling away into a swirling void of darkness. She had to make it across before the entire floor collapsed beneath her. She lunged forward, grabbing onto the railing just as the wood beneath her feet gave way. Hanging on with all her strength, she swung herself onto the remaining steps and pushed herself forward. Then, in the distance, she saw it. A door. Unlike the others, this one glowed with a blinding white light. It pulsed, as if calling her toward it. Behind her, the entity let out another furious howl. "You cannot leave!" It was no longer the powerful master of the house. It was losing its form, its strength, its very existence unraveling along with the curse. But it wasn't giving up. The darkness surged forward one last time, reaching for her, desperate to drag her back. Nia threw herself at the door, her fingertips just brushing against the handle as the shadows wrapped around her ankles. A final choice. Let the house consume her again, or fight with everything she had. With a scream, she yanked her legs free, using the last of her strength to push the door open. Blinding light engulfed her. The house let out one final, piercing wail before everything around her shattered into nothingness. Then, silence. Nia gasped, her body hitting solid ground. For a moment, she lay still, feeling the cool air against her skin, the scent of fresh grass filling her lungs. Slowly, she opened her eyes. She was outside. The house was gone. All that remained was an empty field, bathed in the soft light of dawn. The sky stretched wide and endless above her, free of the oppressive darkness that had once trapped her. And then she saw them, the souls. Dozens of figures stood around her, their translucent forms fading, their faces filled with relief. One by one, they looked at her, nodding in gratitude before vanishing into the morning light. She had done it. She was free. And so were they. But as Nia stood up, brushing dirt from her trembling hands, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her. Something waiting. Then, in the distance, where the house had once stood, she saw it. A single, blackened key, half buried in the soil. A chill ran down her spine, because even though the house was gone, its story wasn't over. Not yet. Nia awoke to the sensation of cold air brushing against her skin. Her eyelids felt impossibly heavy, her body weak, as if she had been asleep for years. A sharp ache pulsed at the back of her head, and when she forced her eyes open, she was blinded by the soft glow of daylight filtering through the trees. She was lying on damp grass. The world around her was unfamiliar, yet painfully real. The sound of birds, the rustling of leaves, the crisp scent of morning dew. It took a moment for her to remember what had happened. The house, the heart, the escape. She sat up slowly, her limbs stiff and sore, as if she had been lying there for days. But something was wrong. Ahead of her, the field stretched wide and empty. There was no sign of the house, not even ruins, not even a foundation. It was as if it had never existed. But she knew it had. She could still hear its whispers echoing in the back of her mind. A distant voice reached her ears. "Over here! There's someone here!" Footsteps. Heavy, hurried footsteps. Nia turned her head to see figures approaching, men dressed in uniforms, carrying tools, their faces lined with age and concern. They weren't just strangers. They were rescuers. Before she could react, they were surrounding her, their expressions a mix of shock and disbelief. One of them, an older man with graying hair, knelt beside her, his hands shaking as he reached out. "Impossible," he whispered. It can't be. Nia tried to speak, but her throat was dry, her voice barely more than a rasp. What? What happened? The men exchanged glances before one of them finally spoke. Miss, what's your name? She swallowed hard. Nia. Nia Adeyemi. A heavy silence fell over the group. The older man's face paled, and another rescuer muttered something under his breath before pulling out a small, crumpled photograph from his pocket. He held it up for her to see. It was a picture of her. But the edges were faded, the paper yellowed with age. The clothes she wore in the picture were different, old-fashioned, decades out of place. Nia's breath hitched. Where did you get that? The man hesitated. This was taken from the case file. You went missing 20 years ago. The world around her seemed to spin. 20 years. She shook her head. That wasn't possible. It had only been days. Weeks, at most. No, she murmured, gripping her arms as a wave of nausea washed over her. That's wrong. That's not right. But the men were looking at her with something beyond disbelief, something closer to fear. The house, she said suddenly. The house that was here. It was real. I was trapped inside. More exchanged glances. The older man exhaled, rubbing a tired hand over his face. That house, he said, voice heavy, burned down 30 years ago. No one's lived here since. Nia froze. No, she whispered. That's not. I was just there. I saw it. The men only shook their heads. Her vision swam, her heartbeat erratic. Nothing made sense. Had she been trapped in something outside of time? Had the house existed in some other reality? She felt a hand on her shoulder. Come with us, one of the rescuers said gently. You need rest. You've been through something unimaginable. She had no strength to argue. They took her away, to a town that had once been familiar but now felt foreign. Buildings had changed, roads had shifted. People stared at her as if she were a ghost. When she arrived at the hospital, doctors and nurses bombarded her with questions. She answered as best she could, but nothing could explain what had happened. To them, she was a missing woman who had somehow returned without aging a day. Then came the reunion. Her family was still alive. Older, worn by grief, but alive. Her mother collapsed the moment she saw her, tears streaming down her face. Nia, my baby. I thought we lost you. Her father held her like he would never let go. Her siblings, now adults, barely recognized her. She wanted to feel relief. She wanted to feel safe. But something inside her was still unsettled. Days passed, then weeks. Nia tried to adjust to a world that had moved on without her. She read news articles about her disappearance, saw the desperate searches that had gone on for years before people finally gave up hope. She found her old belongings, photos, childhood memories locked away in boxes. Yet, something was always wrong. She felt it at night, in the silence of her new home. A presence, a weight in the air. At first it was small things, a chair slightly out of place, a flickering light. Then the whispers started, faint, distant, but unmistakable. She told herself it was just paranoia, a lingering trauma. Until one night, she saw it, standing in the reflection of her bedroom mirror, a shadow, watching, waiting. The house may have been gone, but it wasn't finished with her.